This video discusses different approaches to measurement of GDP. In order to understand different approaches to measurement of the same thing, which is GDP, consider a very simple circular flow diagram, and it represents in a very simple way how things move within a country. Suppose we divide a country into two sectors, one called the household sector. This is where people live, people like you and me reside. And then we have the firm sector, the place where we go and work. And look at the relationship between the household sector and the firm sector. As household sector, we provide factor services to the firm sector. What do we mean by factor services? We provide labor. We are also owners of machine. We are owners of land and capital, and also entrepreneurship. So the household sector provides firms with factor services, and in the firm sector, what we do is we go and produce goods and services. And who consumes goods and services? It is the household sector or people like you and me. So household sector is the provider of factor services, and the firm sector is the provider of goods and services. Now let us bring in financial stuff. Now when we provide factor services, what we receive is factoral income. And since there are different factors of production, each factor of production receives an income. Workers receive wages. Owners of machines receive rate of interest, and we have already discussed why rate of interest is the remuneration for machines. Then we have land and buildings, and the owners of land and building receive rent, and entrepreneurs receive profit. So the firm gives us money, which is called factoral income. And as household sector, what we do with this income we receive, we go out and spend it on goods and services. And who produces goods and services? It is the firm sector. So based on this diagram, we know that value of output must be the same thing as income of this country, and income of this country must be the same thing as expenditure of this country. And all these three things will give us exactly the same number, the way we have described the economy, and that will be GDP. So there are three ways to measure GDP, either through the output approach, or the income approach, or the expenditure approach. In economics, we distinguish between what is ex post and what is ex ante. And by ex post we mean after an event has taken place and we have taken into account everything. By ex ante we mean before an event takes place, or this is at the level of intentions of people. Now in an ex post sense, the way we have looked at the circular flow diagram, value of output is identical to income, and that is, when we use three parallel lines here, it simply means it is identical or by definition true. And in terms of circular flow diagram, income is also identical to expenditure, or value of output, income and expenditure mean one and the same thing, or they measure one and the same thing in an ex post sense. Now at the level of intentions of people, or in an ex ante sense, value of output and income are still identically equal, or they are the same by definition. And income or value of output may or may not equal expenditure. So this is also possible. So you should know the difference between ex post and ex ante and what it means in terms of measurement of GDP. So we know there are three approaches to measurement of GDP. The first approach being the income approach, the second one being the expenditure approach, and the third one being output approach. And in an exposed sense, total income earned equals aggregate or total expenditure, and that will equal the total value of output. Now let us look at income approach to measurement of GDP. And in the circular flow diagram, I had referred to factoral income, and that is the sum of wages, rent, interest, and profits. And when you add up all this for an economy, what you get is net national product at factor cost, or NNPFC. Now, to NNPFC, you add depreciation, and what this will give you is GNPFC, or gross national product at factor cost. So to GNPFC, you add indirect taxes less subsidies, and what this will give you is gross national product at market price, or GNPmp. Now from GNPmp, you remove net income from rest of the world, or NERO, and what you get is GDPmp. Now let us look at details of income approach to measurement of GDPmp for the US. And just note these numbers are in percentage, and the idea is to give you the relative importance of each category. The first item is compensation of employees, which is like wages that we had considered in the previous slide, and this is about 59.2% of GDPmp. Proprietor's income is the income of self-employed or very small businesses, and to that, if you add corporate profits, which is the profits made by bigger firms, what you get is total profit, and that will be 13.4% of GDP. Then we have rental income, which is about 0.1% of GDP. To that we add net interest, 7% of GDP. And when you add up all factoral income for the US, NNPFC is 79.7% of GDPmp. To move from factoral cost or factor cost to market prices, what we do is we add indirect taxes less subsidies, and that is about 9.5% of US GDPmp. When you add this, what you get is net national product at market prices, which is about 89.2% of GDP. To the net concept, we add depreciation, which is about 11%, and what we get is GNPmp. And so the GNPmp is about 100.2% of GDPmp. And from GNPmp, we subtract NERO, which is net income from rest of the world, and this was about 0.2%, and we get the figure of GDPmp, which is 100%. So based on this table, just remember one important part, and that is compensation to employees or the wages is a major component of GDPmp when you're looking at the income approach to measurement of GDP. Now let us look at the second approach to measurement of GDP, and that is from the expenditure side. And total expenditure in a country, which we'll call aggregate expenditure, can be divided into parts. The first one being consumption expenditure by households, by people like you and me, and this will be represented by the symbol C. To this we'll add investment expenditure, and this will be represented by the letter I. And then we'll have government expenditure on directly productive activities, represented by letter G. When we look at this expenditure, we exclude transfer payments like welfare payments. So this is all about government expenditure on directly productive activities. And then we have net exports, which is a difference between exports and imports, represented by NX. So total expenditure of a country, called aggregate expenditure, written as AE, is a sum of C, I, G, and NX. Keep this equation with yourself because this is something we'll use subsequently. Now let us look at expenditure approach from the perspective of the US. We are looking at measurement of GDP. The first item for us is C, which is personal consumption expenditure by households. And this is 68.8% of total GDP. And once again, this is an important component of GDP from the expenditure side. So keep this in mind because this will be relevant or useful when we study policies relating to macroeconomics. This personal consumption expenditure can be divided into three parts. One is our expenditure on durable goods, goods which last for a longer time, like cars, washing machine, and so on. And then our expenditure on non-durable goods, which do not last for a long time. And then look at this item services, the insurance we pay, the medical costs we pay, all that is a part of services. And this is our largest chunk of our consumption expenditure by households, people like you and me. And this component is larger for richer countries, and this component is larger for poorer countries. So just keep that in mind. Now to personal consumption expenditure, we add gross private domestic investment, which was 12.9% of GDP. And then to that we add government expenditure on directly productive activities, and this was about 18.7% of GDP. In the US, most of the government expenditure on productive activities comes from state and local government. It was about 11.2 as compared to federal government expenditures, which was 7.5. To this we add net exports. See, this number is negative 0.5. Negative means for the US, imports are greater than exports. So when you add C, I, G, and NX, what you get is GDPmp, expenditure approach to measurement of GDP. Now let us examine the third approach to measurement of GDP, and this is through output. And what we do is we try to find out output produced by different sectors of the economy. And the concept we use here is value added, which you might remember is the difference between market value and cost of inputs. An economy typically is divided into three sectors: primary, which is made up of agriculture, mining, quarrying, fisheries, and so on. And for a country like the US, this contributes about 2 to 5% to GDP. The second sector is secondary sector, which essentially refers to manufacturing, and this contributes about 15 to 18% of GDP. The third sector is the tertiary sector, and this contributes about 77 to 83% of GDP. Note, for the tertiary sector, this is a sector which includes things like banking, consulting, telecommunications, insurance, finance, and so on. And for this we require educated workforce. So for a rich country, this kind of a structure is very typical, where primary sector, which is essentially agriculture and related activities, is a very small part of GDP. However, if you are looking at a country in Africa, not so developed, what you're likely to find is primary sector is going to be the dominant sector, contributing about 50 to 70% towards GDP. This completes our discussion of this topic. Thank you for your time.